Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third panel, the Pretextual Traffic Stop, How Policing Drivers Fuels Mass Incarceration. My name is Margot, and myself and my peer Nastia are both TULs and toll public interest scholars at the University of Pennsylvania. We are very honored to be your co-moderators for this panel and to be joined by Marco Connor-Diacoy from Transportation Alternatives, Professor Jefferson Jones from Wayne State School of Law, Professor Seo from Columbia Law School, and Josh Vaughn, an investigative reporter with Penn Live. We encourage everyone to please learn more about our esteemed panelists in today's program. So for today, we hope that this discussion will highlight how traffic enforcement, despite its original intention of addressing public safety, in fact compounds the dangers of the open road. Interactions with police officers can be deadly, overwhelmingly so for Black drivers. Traffic charges make up a large part of our criminal legal system, and along with consequences like driver license suspensions and fees, entrap people in poverty, disenfranchisement, and incarceration. But despite its prevalence, traffic policing is often left out of mainstream conversations surrounding criminal justice reform. And as organizers of this panel, Nasi and I are very excited about this conversation because addressing traffic policing is vital for freedom and abolition, a goal that we are both invested in. We'd also like to acknowledge that by focusing on drivers and traffic policing, we are leaving out communities who do not have access to this form of mobility. However, we hope that by pointing out these systems of surveillance, we can comment on this country's overall policing infrastructure, car culture, and spatial structural racism.
Good afternoon. As Margot shared, my name is Nastia, and the two of us have been thinking and talking about this for weeks. So I'm very excited to move on to our panelists ASAP. But before we dive in, a few really quick housekeeping items. If you have a question during this event, please submit it to the Toll Public Interest Center through the Q&A function. We'll then answer questions during Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. If you'd like live subtitles for today's event, please click the button on the bottom of your Zoom screen that says live transcript, then select show transcript, and it should provide live subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see this option, please send a chat to Toll Public Interest Center again, and we will address it. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE passwords will be announced twice during this panel. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits, and the link to the form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email and you're on this webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. And the passcodes will tell us how long you have attended. So the first of our two passcodes for this panel is strategy. It's strategy, so STRATEGY. So the passcode to start us off is strategy. Okay, housekeeping out the way, really excited to dive in. And we wanted to start with an introductory round and ask each of the panelists to please briefly share what motivated you to pursue work in this area. What is it that drives you or inspires you or maybe angers you about these issues enough to devote scholarship and time, labor, and work? And I'll leave it for anyone to jump in first, whoever's feeling inspired to start.
I can go first. I'm a legal historian by training, so maybe start chronologically in terms of scholarship. I came into this topic by accident. I often say I'm a historian of cars by accident. I came to this because I wanted to study the war on drugs, and I consider myself foremost a historian on the war on drugs. And I was interested in law enforcement in the war on drugs, and because I'm a legal historian, I started with the Constitution, and there's one provision, the Fourth Amendment, that most directly regulates what the police can and cannot do. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. A seizure includes a stop, and so that is the first moment in an individual police encounter, so it directly regulates that encounter. And then, of course, a search for drugs, contraband, etc. And so I decided as a historian to look at this, to research this issue of law enforcement in the war on drugs, to start reading all Fourth Amendment cases from the very beginning. And to my surprise, Fourth Amendment cases were rare, until the early 20th century, which coincided with the invention, the mass production of the automobile. And that's how I got started into this history of cars and policing.
I got interested in this area because of my general interest in the use of space and exclusion based on race from various spaces. And so I'm a property professor. And so I'm always thinking about space in these terms of space and equity and who decides who belongs where. And one of the other interests of mine is using property theory to talk about criminal justice issues, because I think that's one of the things that's missing. So when we had that spate of white folk calling the cops on Black folk for just living in, just doing regular things, being in a coffee house, whatever, others were talking about it from a criminal justice lens. I was like, they're using the language of nuisance and trespass. And so the same thing, I had the same thought with regard to these traffic stops that often, especially for Black folk, could end up in higher consequences, right? So higher numbers of arrests, of death, of other sorts of escalations. But all of this to me was a space issue, the road as a shared space and the road as a space of exclusion when it comes to Black and brown people. And so I was thinking of that issue. How does this particular space work? And why is it a space that's fraught with criminal justice consequences, especially for Black and brown communities?
I can jump in. I mean, so obviously I am the non-academic in here, so mine's probably a little bit broader as kind of what brought me into this. So I cover criminal justice, criminal legal issues. I've done that for probably the last 6 or 7 years for different organizations. What's always kind of fascinating about the criminal justice, criminal legal issues is it's an issue that affects everyone, whether you're directly involved in the system or not. Public safety, how we do criminal justice, criminal legal issues affects everyone at the bare minimum of the money that we spend on things and whether we're doing it right or not right, let alone the millions of people who flow in and out of our systems every year for things that probably shouldn't be criminalized and are not making us safer, are actually harming our communities. On this topic specifically, I'm always looking for things that seem like are being done wrong, and I actually came into this in the reporting that myself and Joseph Jafari, who was with Spotlight PA, who's now with the Arizona Republic, because I came across a case shortly after the Rodriguez decision came down from the Supreme Court that was supposed to limit the amount of time or limit the use of canines holding someone at a traffic stop to bring in a canine to sniff the vehicle. We had a case that it was basically these two Black men were coming off of the turnpike. Their argument was they did not use a turn signal to merge from one lane to the other. The officer pulled him over. I mean, pretty clearly that was a pretext reason, because they said there were indicators of criminal activity, which didn't give any explanation as to what those indicators were. But they called for a canine, and it held them there for a significant amount of time afterwards to do a sniff. The dog alerted to the back of the car, and inside they found an unloaded handgun inside of a shoe, inside of a duffel bag, which presumably is not what they were looking for, but it gave them reason to arrest them. But it got me curious how often that happens, because pretty clearly that seemed to be a direct violation of the Rodriguez decision. So it took a long time to kind of get through this with all the other reporting and stuff that was going on. But that's kind of what drew me into this and looking at how state police were doing things on the corridor of where I live and where I report, based on the interdiction and pretextual stops that they make.
And so for me, I think I fall probably in between what Margot and Jamila focus on with the academic focus, and then Joshua from the more public focus in that I do policy advocacy. I'm a trained lawyer and have focused on work in the transportation space, specifically from an advocacy perspective. And so what drives me is my desire to address essentially two injustices. First, the draconian, harmful, and far too often racist policing of Black bodies in the US, of which the transportation and traffic space is just one among many egregious realities of this. And secondly, the other injustice is the reality of traffic violence in the US, with nearly 40,000 people killed in traffic crashes every single year. And these are not accidents, these are preventable crashes. We can predict where, why they happen every single year. And this is an epidemic that is preventable. Other countries have traffic fatality rates that are 4 times lower than this country. And so where does driver accountability fit into this? What responsibility do you have in operating a multi-ton vehicle, which in a split second can claim someone's life, not unlike a loaded gun handled carelessly? A car can even claim many people's lives at the same time, right? So figuring out what that looks like with those realities of the draconian, harmful, and racist policing and the reality of traffic violence, what are the actual solutions to this? And even on a more personal level, although my family in the US stems from Birmingham, Alabama, I grew up in Denmark, which is one of the whitest places on earth. And I moved to the US when I was 18. It's now been my home for more than 2 decades. And I was not stopped by police a single time while living in Denmark, but within my first 2 years in the US, I had been stopped several times, including once here in New York City when I didn't live in the city, driving in New York City with my sister and my white mother from Denmark in the back seat, where the 2 police officers who stopped us basically wanted to make sure that the white woman, my mother, in the back seat was okay. So I eventually became a lawyer and did so specifically to do movement advocacy and lawyering around issues of social injustice. And transportation and traffic safety policy is an inherent social justice issue. And so beyond this sense of injustice, what also drives me in this work is the opportunity that I have to help undo and address these realities with policy solutions and advocacy. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for sharing a bit about your backgrounds. I think it's very fascinating to see how you all come from a bit of different lenses onto this issue. And I think I speak for everyone I say, I cannot wait to see how they will interact for the remainder of this conversation. So I think with that in mind of, seeing how our panelists come from different backgrounds, I know many of the participants of this event come from a variety of law, non-law, different understandings about this issue, already backgrounds. I'd like to start with a baseline question directed first at Professor Jefferson Jones, but please, anyone feel free to jump in. Can you explain for us, what is the pretextual traffic stop and what are we naming, pinpointing, and hopefully unpacking with a specific term?
Yeah, so Joshua started telling us a little bit about what that is, right? So what it is when when law enforcement uses a stop that is not, or makes a stop, a traffic stop that is not based on reasonable suspicion or on probable cause that a crime has been committed, and they use that stop using the traffic laws, and we'll discuss a little bit more of those traffic laws in a minute, but they use that stop. Oftentimes it's based on a hunch that's usually based in the race of the person or where that person is located in space, right, in a neighborhood that they've characterized as high crime. But they don't have reasonable suspicion for the true crime that they're looking for, oftentimes drugs or robberies or whatever it might be. So they use the traffic laws against that driver. And the problem with the traffic laws is that they're almost impossible not to break. There are so many of them, and I think Professor Sio will talk about that, about just how they've proliferated over time. So there's Professor Paul Butler at Georgetown tells a story of in his class where his students go on ride-alongs and one of his police officer friends plays a game called, stop that car, what have you. And basically he tells them in 5 minutes, I can find a traffic violation that will allow me to stop the car. Now, the problem is that the Supreme Court under Wren versus United States has blessed this activity. The Supreme Court has said that as long as there is an underlying traffic violation, and remember those traffic violations can be anything from a failure to use a turn signal to having an air freshener hanging from your rear view mirror in a jurisdiction that doesn't allow them. So if the stop is legitimate on that basis, then it doesn't matter if the true intent of the stop was to do something else, to search for some other crime for which they were not able to establish probable cause. So that's the pretextual stop. And that's the problem, is that basically a police officer can see a Black or brown person, decide that because of who they are, they must be involved in some sort of criminal activity, follow them for a moment. And when they make a rolling stop, the lights go on and they can go ahead and have that stop and look for what they really wanted to look for.
Thank you, Professor. I think I'll kind of hop right in to start unpacking how we got here, right? So before we can think about strategies, solutions, we're starting to really untangle some of these root causes. And this requires us, looking back to a history of legal doctrine, structural racism in this country, and also, Marco, as you were pointing out, road safety, right? To what extent was the current state of affairs around these pretextual stops, was it developed because of road traffic fatalities, or was it really kind of building upon a history of the legal system upholding structural racism and white supremacy? So to zoom back out, I guess I'm asking, how did this kind of traffic enforcement become a reality?
That sounds like a history question, so I'll take a first crack at that. And let me share a slide because I have a few things I want to post. Disabled participant screen sharing. Never mind, I won't share slides. All right. One thing that I wanted to start off by saying is that I can now share. Okay, let me try it again. This is, you know what, I'm just going to talk because this is kind of confusing. I just saw some new buttons I've never seen before. But according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the agency, federal agency that compiles, that does surveys and to figure out various crime statistics, the traffic stop is the most, according to the latest statistics, the most common encounter between individuals and the police. And this is the latest statistic. But as a historian, when I was going through the archives, this was a common theme from the very early 20th century. There were police officers who were writing in 1945 and 1930 saying traffic stops are our most common contacts with citizens. And so we really have to pay attention to how we conduct traffic stops because our professional reputation is at stake. And so, the historical question is, why were traffic stops so common? And it has to do with what Marco was talking about from the very beginning. Cars were really dangerous. They were commonly called machines, just as much as they were called cars, because they are these huge machines that individuals drive, and they created chaos, traffic fatalities. Children were dying on the streets, and so immediately municipalities and counties throughout the country passed volumes and volumes of laws. But then, as Professor Jefferson Jones pointed out, from the very beginning of the invention of automobiles, everybody violated traffic laws. That seems to be a constant aspect of humanity in this history. Usually historians don't find constant things about human nature, but this is a one constant, that people always violated traffic laws. And so it required a great deal of enforcement, which led to both the increase of police departments throughout the country and also increase of their powers to enforce traffic laws. And as early as in the 1920s, I found police department records indicating how their traffic squad was growing because people kept buying cars. A lot of people, more and more people were driving. And so this increase in the size of the police force was being funded by all the traffic fines that they were citing. So from the very beginning, the theme of revenue generation and how they fund different agencies was observed pretty early on in this history. The other interesting thing when I read these police reports from the early 20s and 30s is that they are finding that traffic squad officers are really helpful to the general work and functions of a regular officer. That a traffic squad officer not only can cite for traffic violations, but they can make arrests for other violations of the criminal law. This multitasking function was recognized throughout the country. I found a documentation of this in New York City and Philadelphia, Los Angeles. I think I could find it anywhere because pretty soon the traffic law enforcement function piggybacked along with the criminal law enforcement function of police officers. And why did that happen? Why was this multitasking observed early on? It has to do with the role of cars in American society. Very quickly, American society became a car-dependent society pretty quickly. I think it's been a while since I saw the statistics, but looked at the statistics, but I think by the 1930s, more than half of American families had a car. After World War II, it just became a prevalent feature of American life that people drove. And so with much of American life on the road and in cars, that explains why traffic stops had become, by the early 20th century, 1930s, 1940s, were the most common encounters between officers and police, and two, that multitasking function was possible. At the same time that police officers can look for traffic violations, they realized in the 30s they were looking for violations of prohibition, bootleggers. The latter half of the 20th century, those were drugs and guns. And so that just sets the historical context for the problem that we are confronting today.
And I'll just add to that some thoughts that I have from what Sarah shared, is the focus on individual culpability here in the U.S. And it's clear that the problem here is institutional racism, and it doesn't really matter what is being policed against, whether it's walking, biking, or driving. You see the exact same racial disparities. There is such a thing as walking while Black and biking while Black. Across this country, the racial disparities are almost identical. And so part of the problem is when we choose to use enforcement as the main tool to address traffic violence, and where here in the US we had such a focus on individual culpability that we tend to forget about the structures that actually drive certain actions like dangerous driving, reckless driving, speeding, roads that are built for speeding as opposed to driving built to actually encourage you to drive slower. Streets and roads across the country that lack safe walking infrastructure, with lower income neighborhoods in cities across the country being only 49% of those communities having sidewalks, whereas 89% of higher income communities in cities have sidewalks. So that's part of the problem as well, that there is this focus on individual culpability, whereas in some other countries, for example, with Vision Zero, the effort to really fundamentally change or reach zero for the number of people killed or seriously injured in traffic crashes, In some other countries, there is a focus on the system as being the real culprit, and that the system, building the system so it mitigates the worst of our reckless driving behaviors. So I think that focus on individual culpability is part of it, because once you see that as the primary reason, then enforcement becomes an easy and kind of first step solution to it, which is very misguided. Another component I also believe is critical is that enforcement dollars flow far more easily than anything else. When we look at the real solution to traffic safety, it's really designing our streets for safety. That is fairly expensive, and it doesn't get funded as easily as policing enforcement dollars do, especially from the federal level.
Can I add one more thing? Since we're talking about how structural racism is built into this phenomenon, I want to add just one more structural aspect to that is by relying on enforcement, human enforcement that Marco just mentioned. One additional layer to that structure is the reliance on discretion. And one thing that I always emphasize is discretion goes both ways. The point of discretion is one can be more lenient or one can be harsher. And because from the very beginning, the 20s and 30s, people understood that everybody violated traffic laws and there weren't enough officers to cite every traffic violator. And so from the very beginning, police officers were trained to exercise their discretion. And in the beginning, when most automobile drivers and owners were white, exercising discretion meant exercising positive discretion to let some violators go if it wasn't an egregious violation. The whole invention of traffic tickets is actually a systematic way of exercising discretion. Instead of making an arrest for a violation, which was the traditional way to handle violations of the law, instead of making an arrest, we issue citations so that people can go along their way without having to be summoned away in the middle of the road. But then by the time late 30s is when Black drivers became more and more frequent, especially after World War II. More and more Black families were owning and driving cars. Discretion worked the other way, where one of the first complaints to the NAACP about a traffic officer was in the late 1930s. And I don't think it's much of a coincidence that the Green Book, which was a travel guide for Black drivers navigating Jim Crow, was published right around then in the late 1930s, right? So discretion for Black drivers, for people of color, from the very beginning that they drove in great numbers, they experienced negative discretion. So they're into the very aspect of human enforcement where discretion was necessary because there are so many traffic laws. Discretion is baked in to that enforcement mechanism, and discretion then allows individual determination of whether someone was going to get off with a warning or just a ticket or something much worse, which has happened and is continued to happen to people of color. So that's another structural aspect to the enforcement system that we have today.
Yeah, I think some really helpful threads here, at least in my mind, that both you, Professor Sayo, Marco, have touched upon, is that we have this, notion in America of like individuality and freedom, and that is very much embodied by this concept of like the open road and being able to drive anywhere you want. And yet at the same time, this butts against this system we have, where, as was aforementioned, this is also the site where people have the most interaction with police. It is the heavily policed site. And then again, in this background, we also have the way that structural racism is literally baked into this notion overall. And so I think I see Professor Jeffers just ready to take this on, and I want to move us, I guess, to this next idea of unpacking, like, how is driving treated as a privilege versus a right, especially against this backdrop of white supremacy and structural racism?
Yeah, actually, yeah, it definitely is, because the road has been characterized as white space, right? So spaces can have racial characteristics or have been, they often have been ascribed that. So certain neighborhoods and parks, what have you, Starbucks, right? So the road, it's this, there's the American mythology around the road, right? The open road, and I'm going to get out there and go and find myself or whatever it is, whatever that is, and have my adventure. And Black Americans have ascribed to that notion, but it's also because of its characteristic as a space of freedom for white folk. It's also one that is fraught for people of color. So Professor Nancy Leong makes this statement about how the open road narrative is one of freedom for white people, but one of kind of the narrative is really the narrative of the traffic stop for Black people. And so when we talk about, well, is driving or should it be a right or a privilege? We know that it is now couched as a privilege, and therefore it's a privilege that is subject to, as Professor Seo was saying, it's subject to discretion with regard to who gets granted that privilege and on which bases that privilege is granted. And so the privilege is often precarious for people of color, right? It can be taken away easily, and it's always at risk. Whereas if we were to think more about rights of mobility and freedom itself as a right that encompasses movement and getting from place to place, then I think we could look differently at both how we administer a right to drive or to have, or to at least to use motor vehicles and have some access to it, whatever that could look like. But I think because we couch it as a privilege, then it is something that one has to earn. And we already have notions baked in about who is worthy and who's not worthy and who's always on the edge of losing that ability to declare themselves worthy to take part in this activity.
I want to get specific because I think we've been kind of talking around, how this is baked into the structure of the country, how legal doctrine has supported the reality that we're in now. Professor Seo, you touched upon cycles of revenue generation. And Marco, I really appreciate you highlighting American frameworks of individual culpability in lieu of acknowledging the impact of structures of oppression. And I think often with systemic harms, some of their power that allows them to continue oppressing communities comes from the kind of anonymizing, depersonalizing aspect. So I want to really ask y'all to break it down a little bit, and maybe we'll start with Josh. I know you've done some work around civil forfeiture. Essentially, who is profiting from the system as it currently functions?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to back up just real quick. I mean, I know we talked a good bit about, this being about traffic safety. I think one of the things just to kind of keep in mind, and it goes into, the civil forfeiture aspect of it. Most of these stops, and especially the ones that we looked at, they weren't done for traffic safety. I mean, the entire unit that we looked at, once we started to unpack finding these cases and started unpacking, it was a specific interdiction unit that was doing it. Their job, their specific function on the road at that point when they were making these stops was not safety as far as traffic is concerned to prevent crashes. It was entirely to be making these pretextual stops to ideally, presumably uproot the drug trade. I mean, we could certainly talk about whether that actually happens with the amount of drugs that get taken off the streets through all this. But yeah, I mean, the other thing that happens is civil asset forfeiture. And what happens is you get stopped, they find you with money, decide that money was part of a criminal enterprise and then they basically sue the money or the asset to keep it. Even if it's your property, you are not technically a party to that case until you petition the court and find out about it. And it doesn't have to be a legal stop. So what we found, we looked at traffic stops and civil asset forfeiture cases between 2017 and 2020 in just 3 counties in Pennsylvania: Franklin County, Cumberland County, and Dauphin County. They are all along the Interstate 81 corridor. Small counties. I live in Franklin County. It's not a big area. In those 3 years, we found 30 some civil asset forfeiture cases done by state police, their interdiction unit, through traffic stops. They took $608,000 from people in those cases. A third of those cases had absolutely no criminal charges or a traffic ticket associated to them. Another quarter had misdemeanor convictions, another quarter had felony convictions, and then there was a group of them that were still kind of outstanding criminal cases. 80% of the people that were stopped, 80% of the people that had assets seized were people of color. And we're talking an area that is probably 80% white, if not more. It's a very, very predominantly white area. The money seized included cases that were thrown out because of illegal searches. You had cases where $20,000 was taken through civil forfeiture. It was I think a minor drug. They found a minor bit of drugs. They found unstamped cigarettes in the car. The case was thrown out because it was an illegal search, but the civil asset forfeiture case got to continue going because it's a different burden. It's a different standard. It's all that. In one case, there was $38,000 seized from a person with unstamped cigarettes. He wound up pleading guilty to a summary offense and paid a $400 fine and $90 in the evaded taxes. The state police got to keep, and state police and the attorney general's office, because they kept the civil asset forfeiture case going, they got to keep the $38,000. It goes into law enforcement, into law enforcement's coffers whenever they do these cases. So, I mean, not only is there the incentive for them is kind of that win at all costs to get the drugs, to get the quote unquote criminals off the street, all that kind of stuff. But there's also a financial aspect where if they do these stops, they find money and they can make some kind of argument to keep the money, keep the assets, that goes into their budget and into their finances. And again, it doesn't have to be proven. That we don't have criminal forfeiture here in Pennsylvania, so it's that you don't have to prove any actual criminal intent. You don't have to have any conviction, anything along those lines. It's a civil matter, and you actually have to petition the court to even be part of that case. If it's your money, they come up as, the $38,000 would be Commonwealth versus $38,000. Then you have to petition the court to become party to that case. But I mean, there's just some perverse incentives that go well beyond this idea that you're out there trying to protect traffic safety, because that's not why they're doing it with a lot of these cases.
And Professor Jefferson Jones, can I tap you just to touch a little upon how these cases of traffic policing feed into the larger carceral system, and what can happen if you're not able to pay a simple traffic ticket?
Sure. Yeah. So you don't pay your ticket, or you don't respond timely to a summons that was part of that ticket. Well, now there is a warrant, a bench warrant that is executed for your arrest, which could be executed at any moment, right? They could actually come and look for you. Sometimes that happens, especially if there are enough warrants. But the next stop could end in your arrest. And of course, as Professor Seo mentioned, these stops are ubiquitous. This is where police and citizens often meet up. They can also be deadly, especially for Black and Brown people, Black people even more so, and Black men at an even higher rate. And so one of the things that I noticed that as I was just kind of paying attention to the news cycle, and then later, of course, dug more deeply into the actual data, was that, but from the news cycle, what you're seeing is a lot of those extrajudicial police killings that we saw in the news started with a police stop, started with a traffic stop, right? So Sandra Bland, traffic stop. All of these stops are fraught and can lead to death. So you have fines, custody, all the way escalating possibly up to death, either on the streets or in custody, as was Bland's case. And so, yes, there can be that domino effect. There is the cost of having to go to court, right? So the time cost. So for working people, having to take time off to go to court, which is often one of the reasons that people do not appear. So you don't appear, there could be the bench warrant or a fine enacted, and those fines can escalate to the point that you cannot pay them, which then becomes another problem. I worked for a while in another iteration of my life in a municipal court in Orleans Parish, in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the number of poor people who were before the judge saying, I have this number of fines, I cannot pay them. And then these folks were put on payment plans, which burdened them even further. So if they lose work, and time coming there, this basically just further impoverishes poor communities, which are disproportionately Black and Brown communities. And you, as Joshua pointed out, you have a number of municipalities, of local jurisdictions that are basing their budgets on police stops, not just civil forfeiture, but on traffic fines and their ability to collect. So they're very much incentivized to stop folk, to ticket them, and to pursue these fines.
Can I add one more to that cycle, which is that failure to appear as well as failure to pay fines can also justify a revocation or suspension of license. And so in this country, when most people rely on, outside of New York City, most people rely on driving to get to work and do everything else that they need to do in their lives. The poverty, the inability to pay can lead to not having a valid license to drive to actually get to work and make money to pay those fines. It's a really vicious cycle.
Right.
And yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to piggyback on that, and because what you said was a valid license to drive, right? People will take the risk of driving on a license that is not valid or that, that's been revoked because they need to get to work. They need to get to their childcare. They have things that they must do in order to make their lives work. And so they'll take that risk. And by taking that risk, of course, if they get caught, then the consequences are even higher.
Yeah, I think this is really helpful to unpack because I think this question of state profit is both so interwoven with the way that traffic's policed and motives for traffic enforcement, and then also our both the ability to drive and state profit motives are also surrounded with the way our criminal justice system is structured when it comes to the front end in terms of how people are stopped, as well as the way it entraps people by revoking their licenses, by giving more fines to pay, by, as you point out, Professor Sayo, like literally creating this vicious cycle where people then have to, will choose to break the law or break, driving on a license because they literally give no other choice when driving is your only way to get to your job and then pay off these fines that are thrown onto people. I think having hopefully parsed out for people the ways and many insidious problems that traffic policing causes and are entangled in, I'd now like to direct the final leg of our discussion before Q&A to solutions. So how, and I guess quickly, I would like for everyone to touch upon their ideas about this too. So how would you like to see safety on the road for those around it addressed in a way that does not result or rely on racist, punitive, and deadly police interactions? And how does perhaps preventing harm versus responding to when harm happens factor into these safety issues? And Marco, I think, because you mentioned how some of, in some of your work, how like infrastructure can play such a large, more effective role than policing plays into this, I'd love to punt to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I have spent a great deal of time on. And I think what's really important for this conversation is to remember that driving is an inherently unsafe practice, even under the best of circumstances in the countries where fatality rates are several times less than here in the US. People are still being struck, injured, and killed, or severely maimed and injured for life, even under the best of circumstances. And so, we should not strive to, or I should say, as we strive to ensure that these pretextual, discretionary, draconian traffic stops do not happen, and as we make our policies and laws better, so that as we do this work, we also need to address the other side of this and not forget about the need to invest in our in long-term solutions and some short-term solutions to save lives, because traffic violence, some people would say, does not discriminate, but it does. Black and brown and Native Americans are far more likely to be struck in traffic. So we suffer disproportionately, and we stand to benefit more from real solutions. And just one example of how building and designing our streets for safety. So in New York City, arrests for biking on the sidewalk have been heavily concentrated in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, extremely so. Those are the very same neighborhoods that have lacked safe biking infrastructure in the form of protected bike lanes. People choose to bike on the sidewalk not because they prefer it, but because they feel inherently unsafe biking alongside multi-ton lethal vehicles. When protected bike lanes are installed in New York, biking on the sidewalk drops by as much as 90%. So right there, by building for safety, sorry, that's my dog in the background that's whining. As you build for safety, you make it safer for everyone, for drivers, for people walking, who actually benefit more safety-wise from protected bike lanes than bicyclists do. And you almost negate the need for traffic enforcement in the first place. So that's just one example of how designing our streets for safety is what we should strive for. There's a host of other design solutions and traffic engineering solutions that need to be applied. The challenge there is that it does cost money. It often takes a long time. It's going to take decades for us to reach the place that we really need to get to. And so, in addition to working towards that, what do we do in the meantime? And there are a number of things. There is, I should say, also a place for some form of enforcement. So the one form of enforcement that I and others have been pushing is automated enforcement for speeding and red light cameras. And there's an effort in some places in the country right now, specifically among racial justice advocates, to kind of undo speed red light camera programs. And I find that terribly misguided. There are some of these programs that have not been operated in the way that they should, where unpaid fines can lead to warrants, where they have been disproportionately placed in Black and brown neighborhoods. In some cases, that's because of requests from those very Black and brown neighborhoods and elected officials asking for those cameras to be there. But in places like New York City, the speed and red light camera program have been tremendously effective in saving lives. New York City speed safety cameras have been have reduced, at the locations where they are placed, have reduced traffic fatalities by 55%. They have reduced speeding by more than 70%. tickets are flat $50. Unpaid tickets do not lead to arrest. There's no fines that are imposed for additional non-payment. And the majority of drivers who receive that one ticket do not, at $50, which is about the cost of a tank of gas, do not receive a second ticket again within at least 3 or 4 years. So, so that's just one example, where there are some short-term solutions that we can implement that are not punitive, that are not draconian or inequitable. And there are other solutions as well, like lowering the speed limit and some technological solutions. We have a proliferation of large, oversized SUVs that are detrimental to pedestrians when struck. And there's intelligent speed assistance that helps us drive slower and not speeding without actually having to think about it. So there's a number of solutions that can be applied to both save lives and avoid the inequitable racist policing and enforcement that exists.
I was having trouble unmuting myself. I'm not going to say I'm pushing back a little bit on the crime, on the traffic cameras, because that's the difference, right? There are crime cameras and there are traffic cameras, and I think that they have been conflated, and that's part of the problem. Also, the problem with traffic cameras has been, as Marco pointed out, inequity in the way that they've been instituted. What you just described sounds like a far more equitable system. And so I think that traffic cameras are fine in a system like that, and in one in which they're not just placed as they have been on the borders between what are Black areas and white areas, or just in Black and brown neighborhoods, but instead where we look, we know where the accidents are happening, right? So that's where the cameras need to be, so that it's one of the ways in which we can incentivize people to slow down and to be more aware of their surroundings. The other thing that I think is a good solution is ending traffic stops for minor violations. There is no reason why I need contact with the police officer because of my rolling stop. Send something in the mail, and we can deal with it from there. But why do I need to talk to a police officer about that? So unless I am driving erratically in a manner that could harm myself or others, these other stops really don't need to happen. And there's been some movement around that. It's very slow, but there have been in Oregon, in Virginia, even in Texas, where there's been some movement towards saying, well, we don't need these minor traffic stops. Instead, these can be handled with citations that are mailed to the driver.
One solution I'll add to this conversation is to redelegate traffic law enforcement to a non-police agency, because the pretextual traffic stop happens because of the merger of the traffic law enforcement and criminal law enforcement functions. And so police officers who are looking for gun violations, gun possession or drugs, are incentivized to use traffic violations because they're easy justifications for a traffic stop. And their primary motivation is not safety, it's criminal law enforcement. In traffic law enforcement, the #1 priority should be safety. And so if you redelegate traffic law enforcement to a non-police agency, an agency whose primary function is to promote public safety, I think that goes a long way. First of all, it gets rid of investigatory pretextual stops. Second, it de-escalates the uncertainty, unpredictability, and the anxiety surrounding traffic stops from both drivers and for the police. I've talked to police officers who will say that traffic stop is one of the most dangerous functions which a scholar who's looked at the statistics on officer harm and death have pointed out that that narrative of the dangerousness of a traffic stop is exaggerated, but police officers believe it. There's a really interesting book written by Professor Rosa Brooks of Georgetown Law School, who is, I think, the only tenured law professor who then decided to become a police officer. And she wrote a memoir about it. Part of the memoir is about her relationship with her mother, who's the famous scholar who wrote Nickel and Dimed, Barbara Ehrenrock, who's really sees the police as a kind of an oppressive institution. And so part of the memoir is about her relationship with her mother as she decides to become a police officer. But most of the book is about how police officers are trained, what they do. And a really fascinating part of that book is about how officers are trained from day one to expect danger and to view every situation as suspicious. And with that mentality, of course, traffic stops are going to be a harrowing experience for everybody. And so if we redelegate to a non-police agency where people know that this is just going to be a traffic stop, it's an administrative matter, it's not something that's going to lead to a search of my car and invasion of my privacy and more. If traffic stops has become something that's kind of like a mundane, just pay your ticket and move on, then I think it'll go towards a long way of ending the practice that's in the title of this panel, the pretextual traffic stop. So that's one solution.
So I would say all of the above is probably my answer. I mean, I think it's got to be a holistic approach. I mean, as far as safety is concerned, you've got to redesign the infrastructure so that you're slowing drivers down, so that you're making the roads themselves safer and reduce crashes. I think there is certainly a lot of space for automatic enforcement, with the massive caveat of that it doesn't become just an automatic way of drawing revenue from people. I mean, what you want, flipping that dynamic of if you speed, you're going to get caught, and the certainty is there that you're going to get caught is obviously a lot better than the system that we have now, where everybody speeds. I speed. We all speed when we drive, and we all do things in our cars that we shouldn't be doing because we know that like 99.999% of the time we're not going to get caught. We're not going to get in trouble for it. So yeah, the automatic enforcement is, I think, helpful. Decoy cars to help reduce people speeding, as long as you're moving them around so that people don't get used to the car knowing that it's a decoy. That is I think that's one thing that could possibly help. I think there's a lot of things as far as safety is concerned. I think that as far as, I would go a step further and say on the pretextual stop, because the pretextual stops aren't particularly about public safety. I think ending civil asset forfeiture, requiring it to be at the very least criminal forfeiture, that you have a conviction along with it, could help reduce some of that financial incentive. And I think there's a big part where we need to be relying on, we need to be pressuring our district attorneys and our prosecutors to not take these cases. If very clearly this was not a legal stop and it was not a legal search, the DA needs to be saying, no, I'm not bringing these charges, not I'm going to find a way to get a really good plea deal, because I know that if this goes to a suppression, that's going to get thrown out. You need the district attorneys, you need prosecutors putting pressure to make sure that they are that independent check on the police power. Certainly there's a drug war aspect to all of this, that ending the drug war could probably help. I think that I don't know if you ever get rid of it, because as long as you are allowing these stops to happen and there is some kind of motivation, there's always going to be some black market that they can make an argument for as to why you're making stops. And there's always going to be a black market for something that's going to be enforced. So I think you really got to be relying on your district attorneys to not take these cases and truly act as that independent check, which isn't the case in most times. And getting rid of civil asset forfeiture would go a long way.
And for courts to stand up and say that Wren is wrong, that's what we see. What we saw in Oregon in 2019, the Oregon Supreme Court held that under its state constitution, that it's impermissible for police officers to use a stop for minor traffic violation. as justification for investigating other crimes. So that needs to be then enshrined in state constitutions and enforced in state courts.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your very generative and thoughtful responses to that question and throughout this entire panel so far. I'm going to now transition us to some Q&A from the audience. I know it's been pretty active there. But before we start reading out some of those questions, I am going to announce our second CLE word for this event. So if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, the second and final password for this panel is future. That's FUTURE. Again, the second CLE password for this event is future.
I want to kick us off with a question from the chat, from the Q&A that I'm sitting with. And I think Professor Saya, this ties in well to your mentioning of kind of redelegating to a non-police agency. So the question was that much of the discussion has centered around transferring power away from police departments to departments of transportation, but they themselves have been responsible for designing and creating these systems that are causing harm. And honestly, this makes me think about the importance of public perception of these issues. So I also kind of want to circle back a little bit to something Margot mentioned in our introduction, that, you know, this isn't really seen as a huge problem in kind of the widespread public in the same way that, for example, policing around drug issues and kind of the war on drugs has become a little bit more present in the public imagination as a huge carceral problem. So I'm thinking, for example, about the use of social workers in the family policing system and how public perception around social workers policing families may be a little warmer because they're not police. So I'm curious, if we are talking about redelegating from police departments to like Department of Transportation or to another body, delegating the responsibility here, how can we make sure that we don't just end up with another punitive system, another model that allows discretion, which will inevitably allow racist bias? And to what extent is it important for us to increase public perception about how widespread and impactful this problem is in order to really start shifting some of these dynamics?
Sure, I can start off. So the two questions. So the first one is, I think the same answer that Marco gave with respect to technology. Technology is not a panacea. It's how we use technology, right? Technology can be an incredible tool, beneficial tool, but if used wrongly, anti-democratically, or unequally, then it's horrible. And so the task is not to shun technology, but it's to use it and to govern its use. And so the same answer that Marco gave, I would give to the delegation of traffic law enforcement to any other agency. I think it makes sense to segregate that from a police enforcement agency because of the problem of pretextual trafficking, but that doesn't solve everything, of course. We still have to govern the citations. We have to interrogate, you know, how much should we how much should the fines be set? Maybe we even have a conversation about varying the fine schedule depending on ability to pay even. There's more conversations to be had about equitable enforcement, even with a non-police agency. So the conversation doesn't stop there with just simple redelegation. It's an ongoing conversation about how to make it more equal. The second question I think you had was the public perception of this. And it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a documentarian who was working on a film about traffic enforcement and traffic stops in the United States. And she was telling me about the narrative problem that she had, because there's one segment of people that she's talked to, mostly white people, who are kind of incredulous that this might be a problem, because their experiences with traffic stops are just, you know, the officer asking driver's license and registration, please, and, you know, just, you know, worst that can happen is a traffic ticket, or on a good day, they'll let one go with just a warning, and it's just kind of incredulity that this is a serious problem. But there's another segment of people that she has talked to, Black and brown people, where they're like, this is not news. You're telling a story that we all know. And so she was wondering, we were trying to puzzle through how could she tell a narrative in her film about this issue without kind of maybe a dubious segment of the audience, and another segment that just finds this kind of not an anonymous because they know this, they've lived this. And so so we were talking through, and one of the things that I suggested was maybe kind of doing I actually have the books in my on my desk here, which is one is Tactics for Criminal Patrol, which is a law enforcement book about how to use traffic violations to find drugs. It's all about how to use minor traffic violations, basically. To juxtapose this with this book, the ticket book, which is for, and the audience for this book is white people. And this whole book is about how to challenge your speeding ticket, what you can do to challenge your speeding ticket. They go to two very different audiences, right? So it is a narrative challenge, and it's an educational challenge too. Public education is really important. And so I think being aware of that challenge, knowing who our audience is at a particular moment, and being able to speak to different audiences and where they come from, and just showing them that there are people who live very differently with very different experiences. And maybe that's a starting point.
I just sorry, just one quick thing. I mean, on the point of, how you prevent it from becoming another kind of system of systemic oppression, we need to collect better data. I mean, one of the big issues with trying to with the reporting that we did is all criminal cases. With criminal cases, we have race data that comes along with criminal cases. It is exceedingly difficult to get race data on traffic violations in Pennsylvania. I mean, so we don't really, from the outside, it's very hard to just examine, are you seeing even just an abundance or a disproportionate number of people of color being stopped for traffic tickets, all that kind of stuff. We just don't have that data. I mean, it's certainly not the answer, but I think just being able to collect and being able to look at the data and see what is actually happening would go a long way. I mean, we fix the things that we measure. If we aren't measuring it, we don't care about it to actually do something about it. So we need to, at the very least, be collecting the data to understand what's happening.
Yeah, you could get that data, but it would be a lot of work because it would have to be unanonymized information on who was stopped, and then you could from there find out who those people are. But those are, all of these extra steps that could be collected at the point of the stop.
Everybody, thank you so much for such a great conversation. I know there were more questions, and I hope if any of the panelists are willing to continue this conversation with folks who maybe didn't get their question answered, if you'd like to share your email or something in the chat. I do want to finish with a rapid fire round, just to kind of bring everyone back together. And I did also want to highlight, given that, at the University of Pennsylvania, based in Philadelphia, if folks haven't been aware at some of the city council efforts in Philadelphia, this came through the chat and was a great reminder for decriminalizing minor traffic violations. Basically, I would encourage folks to take a look and see if there's any advocacy support that is needed for some of these efforts, or kind of proliferating their implementation. But with the final rapid fire round with our wonderful panelists, and building off the conversation we had about the way forward and next steps, we wanted to ask, when you envision pursuing a future where driving can be a real expression of liberty for everyone, rather than a mechanism to prop up state and police power, what do you see as the main priority, or at least the first priority? And I'll ask Marco to start us off.
Sorry, Nastia, could you repeat it? I couldn't hear.
Sure thing. What would you say is the main priority or the next priority in moving toward the future we've been discussing, where driving can be an expression of liberty, is safe, and not propping up state enforcement and police revenue and power?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's some challenges. I would say just one challenge that comes to my mind also listening to and having listened to this discussion is that the car is viewed as part of the American dream and something that folks that people aspire to, right? And you're looked at very strangely in some places if you're walking or biking, and so this goes to the role of the car and how it's viewed as a privilege or a right, and this marriage really of the car and the American dream is one of the things that makes the solutions that we need to apply so much harder to implement, because along with a car goes often a parking space, and car parking space on public street is seen as a right, even though it's public space allowing people to store it for free. The solutions that we need to have less car dependence and to build streets and roads that are safer require, in some cases, repurposing some of those car parking spaces for better uses, for safer streets and roads. And that goes kind of against that idea you have a right to the car as part of the American dream. So it's really challenging to overcome. So that's just one thing I would just note here at the end. So I think in terms of like what is needed, just very quickly, obviously, most of these current offenses need to be decriminalized. We need to move enforcement away from police departments as part of the decriminalizing, move it in some cases to automated enforcement. There's no need for an armed police officer to conduct a traffic stop for speeding, and then often in some cases causing additional danger through a police chase, which, by the way, is the primary way in which police officers are killed in the category that they often group as traffic kind of related incidents, not the police traffic stop itself, but traffic crashes. So decriminalizing that, moving towards equitable, fair enforcement, automated enforcement, and then also in some cases having where some human enforcement is still appropriate, having it only be unarmed civilian enforcement, just like some parking enforcement is done by civilian unarmed folks. And then lastly, we need to invest in safe streets and engineering to build our cars so that they're safe, lower speed limits, and recognizing the long-term challenge that some of these solutions to redesign our streets for safety will take time. We need to use quick-built solutions that use low-cost, quickly implementable solutions to kind of tie us over in the meantime.
I'll just ask if anyone has any final words to add. I think, Marco, you covered a lot of priorities. You've given us a big to-do list. So if there's anything else that any of the panelists would like to add just as we finish our conversation today.
No, I agree with that to-do list, and I think it really does encompass everything.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much. This has been such a generative discussion, and Margot and I have been so excited to be reading and thinking, and now finally be able to be engaging with you about these conversations. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of work to do, Marco, and we will start transitioning to our next panel, which is Burden by Design, the Harms of Inaccessibility, and that'll begin imminently. Thank you all so very much.